The city behind them is still burning. The fighting is already over, and three warriors are just standing there, staring down at the dirt. Not at an enemy, at a baby, wrapped in cloth, left behind in the chaos. One of them actually scratches his head because now what wasn't a question anyone had trained them for. You'd assume this moment only ends one of two simple ways. The baby dies, or the baby just vanishes from history and nobody ever finds out what happened. That's the assumption almost everyone has. It's also almost completely wrong. Because what actually happened to kids like this wasn't chaos. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't a coin flip. It was one of the most consistent, most repeated systems in the entire ancient world. And we can actually prove it. Palace inscriptions, court records, skeletons, even DNA still sitting inside millions of people alive right now. So let's actually go answer the question written right there in yellow. Now what? Start in Mesopotamia with an empire that turned this exact question into a science, the Assyrians. By the 8th century BCE, when an Assyrian army took a city, it didn't just win, it emptied the place. Men, women, and children marched out under guard, recorded in stone. Assyrian palace reliefs carved specifically to celebrate these campaigns show it in disturbing detail. Small figures, walking hand in hand with adults, herded along with the livestock and the loot. This wasn't panic, it was policy. Historian Bustany Oded spent years mapping these deportations from the actual Assyrian royal archives and found the same pattern repeated across centuries. Families were deliberately split between provinces, different destinations, different new masters, on purpose. Because a child raised far from home with no memory of who their people used to be isn't a threat, they're an investment. Some ended up as household labor. Some ended up building the walls and palaces archaeologists still dig up today. And some, the promising ones, got absorbed directly into the empire itself. Trained as scribes, trained as soldiers, sometimes trained as officials serving the very government that had taken them. Within a generation, plenty of these kids weren't captives anymore in any sense they could still feel. They were Assyrian. That was always the entire point. Erase the origin, keep the labor. But here's the thing. Assyria wasn't even the most brutal version of this idea. It wasn't even the most organized. It wasn't even the most personal. Because 600 years later, in a completely different part of the world, one small island was about to show exactly how cold this decision could actually get. A single vote cast by an entire city that decided the fate of every child on it all at once. And the man who watched it happen wrote it all down in real time. Let's go there next. The year is 416 BCE. The island of Milos, a small, neutral city-state, had refused to pick a side in the Peloponnesian War. Athens sent an army anyway. Historian Thucydides, who was alive at the time, recorded exactly what happened next. Athenian envoys arrived first and gave the Melians a choice: submit or be destroyed. The Melians refused, so Athens laid siege to the city. And when it finally fell, the Athenian assembly voted on what to do with the survivors. Every adult man of Milos executed. Every woman and every child sold into slavery. Thucydides doesn't soften any of it. He records it as routine because in the ancient Greek world, this wasn't a war crime. It was simply how a siege ended if the losing side waited too long to negotiate. And Milos wasn't some rare horror story. It was a standard outcome, repeated across the Greek world for centuries. So what actually happened to those specific children? Some were sold at slave markets on islands like Delos, one of the busiest human trafficking ports in the entire Mediterranean. Bought as domestic servants, raised inside a stranger's household in a language they hadn't been born speaking. Some were bought specifically as pedagogae, tutors, assigned to raise the very children of the family that now legally owned them. A slave child teaching a free one, growing up under the same roof on opposite sides of a line neither of them chose. A small number, if their owners were wealthy or invested enough, could eventually be freed, manumitted as adults into a strange half-freedom in a city that still remembered exactly where they'd come from. But for most, freedom never came at all. They simply grew up, married, had their own children, inside households that were never theirs to begin with. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Greece treated this as routine. Rome was about to treat it as an entire branch of the economy, an industry so massive it could reportedly process tens of thousands of people in a single day at its peak. One quick thing before we get into that, because it genuinely gets bigger from here. If a real, deeply researched story is worth your time, subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it actually helps. Okay, Rome. By the final years of the Roman Republic, war had become a supply chain, and children were one of its most valuable products. When Julius Caesar campaigned through Gaul, ancient sources describe entire captured populations being sold off wholesale to slave traders following right behind the army. Historians estimate Caesar's Gallic campaigns alone may have slaved somewhere around 1 million people in under a decade, children included. Without exception, marched to ports, loaded onto ships, funneled towards massive slave markets. The largest on the island of Delos, that same one from before. One child among an ocean of strangers being sorted, priced, and sold like livestock. But here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. In wealthy Roman households, some enslaved children ended up in a strange, almost contradictory position. Educated, sometimes literate in both Latin and Greek, trusted with managing household finances, tutoring the family's own children, or running entire business operations for an owner who never lifted a finger himself. A slave and simultaneously indispensable. Roman law even had a formal mechanism for this, manumission, a ceremony that could free a slave, sometimes specifically as a reward for proving that valuable. Some former child captives lived to see their own children born completely free as Roman citizens. Others never did. They lived their entire lives and died still legally the property of somebody else. One of the starkest examples comes from Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, obliterated in 146 BCE at the end of the Third Punic War. Roman accounts describe the city burning for 17 straight days. When it was finally over, the tens of thousands of survivors, women and children among them, were rounded up and enslaved. As one final act of erasure, an entire civilization converted almost overnight into cargo. A whole generation of Carthaginian kids grew up not speaking their own language, inside the households of the empire that had just burned their home to the ground. The empire didn't just conquer the land, it patiently absorbed the next generation as raw material. And nearly 1,000 years later, on the complete opposite side of Europe, a totally different set of raiders ran almost the exact same playbook. Except this time, we didn't just find the records. We found the actual proof sitting in real bones from real skeletons sequenced in an actual lab. Let's finish there. The Vikings. Norse raiders hit the coasts of Britain and Ireland for roughly 3 centuries. And taking captives wasn't a side effect of raiding, it was frequently the entire point. The city of Dublin, founded by Norse settlers, functioned for generations as one of the largest human trafficking ports in Northern Europe. Captured people, women and children heavily among them, bought, sold, and shipped out from its docks. Some became thralls, the Norse word for slave, working farms across Scandinavia. Others were carried much further, all the way to a newly settled island at the edge of the known world. Iceland. For a long time, exactly how many captured women and children ended up among Iceland's earliest settlers was pure guesswork. Then in 2018, geneticist Agnor Helgason at Decode Genetics sequenced the actual DNA from 25 skeletons, Iceland's first generation of settlers. Published in the journal Science, the results were almost too clean to believe. The male lineage, father to son, was overwhelmingly Norse, but the female lineage, mother to daughter, was heavily Gaelic, from Ireland, from Scotland. Norse fathers, foreign mothers. Exactly the genetic fingerprint you'd expect if a huge number of those women, and very likely the children beside them, arrived not as willing settlers, but as captives. One sequenced skeleton stood out specifically, a man of almost entirely Gaelic ancestry buried among Norse settlers. Grave goods suggesting he'd been fully absorbed into their community by the time he died. Possibly captured as a child, raised Norse, buried Norse, his real origin only readable again over 1,000 years later in his own bones, which is the pattern sitting underneath this entire video. Assyria, Milos, Rome, Iceland, 4 completely unconnected civilizations, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart, independently landing on the exact same answer. Don't just conquer a place, take its next generation and quietly turn them into yours. So back to that baby, in the thumbnail and the dirt in front of 3 confused warriors, now you actually know what "now what" usually meant. Here's a real question, and I genuinely love your take on it. Which fate actually sounds worse to you? Being fully erased into a new identity, like those Assyrian and Icelandic kids? Or being sold into a Roman household where you might, eventually, actually earn your freedom? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of real, uncomfortable history you want more of, tap like before you go. Because somewhere out there right now, someone's entire family tree runs directly through a kid who never chose any of this. A name lost, a language forgotten, and a bloodline that, against every possible odd, made it all the way to now.